Tonight, the first topic we explore is the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and enigmatic women in all of medieval history. A queen not just once, but twice, first of France, then of England. She wasn't simply a consort lost in her husband's shadow. No, Eleanor ruled lands, led armies during the Crusades, and outwitted kings in velvet gloves. From political marriages to personal rebellion, from courtly love to civil war. Eleanor's legacy shaped Europe's royal houses for centuries. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if you enjoy our content. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are too interesting, and we are working on some boring ones. It's time now to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight. Together. Eleanor of Aquitaine entered the world around the year 1122 in a region that pulsed with culture, wealth, and ambition. She wasn't born into just any noble house. She was the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, a realm so vast it rivaled the power of the French crown itself. Her inheritance would one day stretch from the Loire River to the Pyrenees, making her the most sought-after bride in Christendom. But what truly set Eleanor apart wasn't just land, it was intellect. Raised in the glittering court of Poitiers, Eleanor was immersed in a world of poetry, philosophy, and politics. Unlike most girls of her era, she was rigorously educated. She read Latin, understood classical texts, and was well versed in music, law, and the strategic art of diplomacy. Her court would later be famed for inventing and spreading the ideals of chivalry and romantic love. But even as a teenager, Eleanor was more than charm and courtliness. She was being groomed to lead. Everything changed in 1137. Her father, while on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, fell ill and died suddenly. Eleanor, just 15, became Duchess of Aquitaine, a title that gave her command over nearly a third of what we now call France. But as a young girl ruling one of Europe's richest territories, she couldn't remain unwed for long. Her guardians wasted no time. Within months, she was married to Louis, the heir to the French throne. It was a political match, engineered to bring Aquitaine under royal control. Days after the wedding, King Louis VI died, and Eleanor became Queen of France alongside her new husband, now Louis VII. But Eleanor was no passive queen. From the moment she arrived in Paris, her bold spirit clashed with the sombre court. Louis was devout, ascetic, and inexperienced. Eleanor was lively, ambitious, and unafraid to speak her mind. The tension between them was immediate, and only deepened over time. Even so, Eleanor had positioned herself at the heart of power. In a kingdom where queens were expected to bear heirs and remain silent, she was already setting the stage for something entirely different. A life that would upend tradition, challenge monarchs, and shape the future of Europe. In 1147, a monumental event shook Christendom, the launch of the Second Crusade. Cities in the east had fallen, and the Pope called upon the kings of Europe to take up the cross. Louis VII, devout and eager to prove himself, answered the call. But what shocked the continent wasn't his participation. It was that his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, would join him. This wasn't a symbolic journey. Eleanor brought with her hundreds of knights and vassals from Aquitaine, pledging them to the cause. And more unusually still, she personally led a group of noblewomen, dressed in armour, riding alongside the men. Chroniclers were aghast. They accused her of playing Amazon, of turning a holy war into a parade of vanity. But Eleanor was undeterred. The journey was grueling. The army marched through France, Germany, Hungary, and finally into the rocky terrain of Asia Minor. The blazing heat and treacherous mountains drained morale. Disease spread. Food ran short. Louis, always hesitant, proved a poor commander. The French army suffered devastating losses in Anatolia. It was a failure of leadership, and Eleanor wasn't afraid to say so. In Antioch, she sought refuge with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, a brilliant and charismatic prince who ruled the city. Here, Eleanor felt at ease. Some said too much. Whispers began, of late-night meetings, of an improper closeness. Rumours of an affair between Eleanor and Raymond spread like wildfire. Whether true or not, Louis believed them. Enraged, he forced Eleanor to leave Antioch against her will. Their marriage, already strained, now cracked beyond repair. Eleanor had expected to lead, to advise, even to strategize, but Louis had expected silence and obedience. As they returned from the failed crusade, the difference between them was no longer tolerable. They had one surviving daughter, but no male heir. Their personalities, values, and ambitions were worlds apart. Back in France, Eleanor began pushing for an annulment. It wasn't difficult to obtain. The church cited consanguinity, or blood relation, a common excuse. In 1152, their marriage was dissolved. She kept her lands, she kept her title, and within months she made a shocking move that would alter the fate of Europe. She married a young, ambitious duke named Henry of Anjou. That young duke would soon become King of England. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry, Duke of Anjou, in 1152, just 8 weeks after her annulment from Louis VII, it was a scandal. Not only was it quick, it was strategic. Henry was 11 years her junior, bold, and already carving out a path to power. 2 years later he ascended the English throne as King Henry II, and with him Eleanor became Queen of England. This new union was not just romantic, it was geopolitical. By marrying Henry, Eleanor united her vast Aquitaine holdings with the English crown, creating an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. France was now surrounded by Angevin power, and Eleanor, at the centre, held lands even her new husband didn't control outright. Together, they were a formidable team, at least at first. Eleanor gave Henry 5 sons and 3 daughters, and she wielded real political authority, often ruling in his stead when he was away. She moved between English and French courts with grace and command, and her court in Poitiers became a beacon of art, poetry, and the ideals of chivalry. It was here that the concept of courtly love was cultivated, a romantic intellectual game that celebrated refined love and noble suffering. But even as she presided over a golden age of culture, her marriage to Henry began to sour. Henry was a tireless ruler, brilliant but ruthless. He could be cruel, dismissive, and increasingly unfaithful. His affair with the fair Rosamond Clifford became legendary, and Eleanor, once the queen of his realm and heart, was sidelined. Still, Eleanor didn't retreat. She remained deeply involved in statecraft and diplomacy. She arranged marriages for their children across Europe and advised Henry on major decisions. But behind the scenes, resentment simmered. She was no longer the young duchess dazzled by the promise of power. Now in her 40s, she saw her influence waning, and her husband growing more tyrannical, not only with her, but with their sons. Eleanor's life had never followed the traditional path of a medieval queen. She had defied kings, led armies, and held her own in a male-dominated world. But the greatest rebellion of her life, against her own husband, was still to come. By the 1170s, the dazzling alliance between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II had withered into bitterness and distrust. Their early passion had dissolved into rivalry, and Eleanor, once the jewel of his empire, was now more like a prisoner in her own court. But she was not a woman to accept silence or submission. If her husband would not respect her, she would defy him through the one force he feared most, their sons. Henry and Eleanor had raised a dynasty of restless, ambitious boys. Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. But Henry II, though brilliant, was paranoid and possessive. He refused to share real power with them, even after crowning his eldest, Henry the young king, as co-ruler in name only. Tensions within the royal family exploded. In 1173, Eleanor made a daring and dangerous move. She encouraged her sons, especially young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, to rebel against their father. It wasn't just a family squabble, it was an armed revolt, with the backing of King Louis VII of France and other European nobles. Eleanor's reach, even in her 50s, was astounding. She rallied allies, forged letters, and mobilized armies against the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. For a moment, it seemed the rebellion might succeed. Henry II was caught off guard. England and Normandy were under siege, but his response was swift and brutal. The rebellion crumbled. Geoffrey surrendered. Young Henry, too weak to lead, faltered. And Richard, though brave, lacked the force to win. But the deepest betrayal Henry felt wasn't from his sons, it was from his wife. Eleanor, attempting to flee Aquitaine in disguise, was captured. She was taken to Henry's court, stripped of her authority, and placed under house arrest. For the next 16 years, she would live in confinement, moved from castle to castle under constant watch. No trials, no titles, no more freedom. But Eleanor's spirit did not break. She endured. She waited. And she watched as her sons, now men, continued to battle their father and each other. She knew time would shift the power balance again. Eleanor had survived the Crusades, political exile, and 2 royal marriages. And now, in silence, she prepared for her next chapter, one that would restore her to power in a way no one saw coming. In 1183, Eleanor's life took a grim turn and an unexpected opening. Her eldest son, Henry the young king, died of dysentery while on campaign. The rebellion he once led against his father had failed, and now the heir to the throne was gone. With his death, a political void emerged, and Eleanor, still under house arrest, found herself once again at the centre of royal strategy. Her second surviving son, Richard, bold, brilliant, and utterly fearless, now became Henry II's new heir. But trust between father and son was broken. Henry favoured his youngest son, John, hoping to divide lands between them and keep Richard in check. Richard, however, wanted full control of Aquitaine, his mother's lands, and his by right. Eleanor, despite her imprisonment, remained in contact with Richard. She encouraged his ambition and loyalty to Aquitaine. She knew his strength, his charisma, and his popularity among the nobles. If anyone could outmaneuver Henry II, it was Richard. And in 1189, fate finally moved in her favour. That year, Henry II, worn by age, betrayal, and illness, died. The Plantagenet king, who had ruled like a lion and imprisoned his queen for over a decade, was gone. Richard ascended the throne as King Richard the Fund of England, Richard the Lionheart, and his very first act as king, he released his mother. After 16 years in captivity, Eleanor of Aquitaine walked free. She was in her late 60s now, but her resolve had never weakened. Richard knew her worth. He made her his chief advisor and entrusted her with immense political power. As he prepared to launch the Third Crusade, it was Eleanor who would act as regent in his absence, ruling England in his name. She didn't waste time. Eleanor travelled across the realm, secured Richard's coronation, and quelled unrest. She negotiated treaties, settled disputes, and managed the kingdom with the skill of a seasoned monarch. Even more impressively, she arranged powerful marriages for her daughters and granddaughters, weaving the Plantagenet bloodline through the courts of Europe. Eleanor wasn't just a queen mother, she was the beating heart of an empire. And while her son went off to fight in the Holy Land, it was Eleanor, regal, sharp, and undiminished by age, who held the realm together. With King Richard I off to fight in the Third Crusade, the Kingdom of England was left in uncertain hands, but not helpless ones. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her late 60s, stepped into power once more. And she did not simply fill a vacancy. She ruled as a true regent, with all the authority and sharp decision-making of a monarch. It was an unstable time. While Richard battled in the Holy Land, his youngest brother John, ambitious and reckless, began plotting to seize the crown for himself. He conspired with King Philip II of France, hoping to carve up Richard's territories while the true king was thousands of miles away. But Eleanor stood in his path. She moved swiftly, rallying loyal nobles to Richard's side, reinforcing fortresses, and keeping John's ambitions in check. Even more impressively, she carried out delicate diplomatic missions well into her 70s. One of her most significant tasks was securing a politically vital marriage between her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, and the future King Louis VIII of France, a union that would have far-reaching consequences for both kingdoms. Still, trouble was never far behind. In 1192, Richard was captured on his return journey from the Crusades, taken prisoner by Duke Leopold of Austria and held for ransom. The news shocked Europe. His enemies saw opportunity. But Eleanor, refusing to let her son languish, sprang into action. Despite her age, she rode across the Alps in the dead of winter to plead for his release. She negotiated, raised the colossal ransom, said to be 150,000 marks, a sum that nearly bankrupted England, and ensured Richard's freedom. Her determination and persistence stunned European courts. It was not a young warrior who rescued the Lionheart. It was his mother. Once Richard returned, their bond remained strong, but peace was short-lived. In 1199, while suppressing a rebellion in Aquitaine, Richard was wounded by a crossbow bolt and died from infection. Eleanor was nearly 80. She had outlived most of her children, and once again, the question of succession fell to her. With Richard gone and John next in line, the future of the Plantagenet dynasty once more rested on Eleanor's shoulders. But for the Queen of Aquitaine, whose life had been war, marriage, rebellion, and diplomacy, one final mission still remained. Richard the Lionheart was dead. His younger brother John, now poised to take the throne, was a far cry from his legendary sibling. Unpredictable, impulsive, and deeply mistrusted by many nobles, John's path to kingship was not guaranteed. Once again, all eyes turned to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the aging matriarch whose political instincts remained unmatched. But this time, it wasn't just a crown she had to secure. It was the very future of the dynasty. Even before Richard's death, Eleanor had been working behind the scenes to shore up alliances and protect the family legacy. When John ascended in 1199, she lent her name and presence to his cause, using her status as the revered Dowager Queen to legitimize his rule. Though she had long distrusted John, she understood the stakes. Without unity, the empire her marriage had created, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, could shatter. Yet Eleanor's final mission wouldn't be in England. It began in Castile, far to the south, where her granddaughter was being raised. The child, named Blanche, was to be the next diplomatic thread in Eleanor's web. The aging queen journeyed, at the age of 77, across the mountains and treacherous lands of medieval France and Spain to retrieve Blanche and bring her to the court of France. There the girl would be wed to the French heir, ensuring peace between two ancient rivals. That journey was more than symbolic. It showed the world that Eleanor, even at the twilight of her life, was still Europe's most powerful political matron. Monarchs respected her. Nobles followed her. Enemies thought twice before crossing her. But time was catching up. After securing Blanche's betrothal, Eleanor returned to Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, a quiet religious retreat she had long favoured. She withdrew from politics, not because she was defeated, but because her final moves had been made. She had ruled alongside kings, given birth to 2 generations of monarchs, and shaped the course of Europe through ink, sword, and silk. In her last years, she took the habit of a nun. But no one mistook her for ordinary. Even in contemplation, Eleanor of Aquitaine remained a sovereign soul, one who had written her own legend in a world built to silence women. Eleanor of Aquitaine passed away on April 1st, 1204, at the age of roughly 82. Her death marked the end of an era, not just of a queen, but of a woman who had shaped the destinies of 2 kingdoms and 3 generations of rulers. Few in medieval history had lived so long, and fewer still had lived with such influence, intensity, and independence. She died at Fontevraud Abbey, the same quiet monastery in the Loire Valley where she had spent her final years. But this was no cloistered nun in obscurity. Even in retreat, Eleanor remained a symbol. Kings and ambassadors still sought her counsel. Nobles paid homage. Her name carried weight not just in England and France, but across the courts of Europe. She was the widow of two kings, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England. She was the mother of Richard the Lionheart and King John. She had been Duchess, Queen, Prisoner, Regent and Diplomat, and she had worn each title like armour. Her burial was no less symbolic. She was laid to rest beside Henry II and Richard I at Fontevraud Abbey, the powerful men who had defined her life and whom she had outlasted. A statue atop her tomb shows her not with a sceptre or crown, but with a book, a quiet testament to her intellect, her education, and her lifelong love of learning. Even in death, Eleanor refused to be remembered as simply a queen. She was a thinker, a ruler, a matriarch, and above all, her own woman. Across Europe, the reaction to her death was one of awe and reverence. Chroniclers, even those who had once criticised her, now praised her wisdom, her strength, her grace. She had been controversial, yes, bold in her loves, unflinching in her politics, but never forgotten, never ignored. Eleanor's legacy is not just in the castles she ruled or the kings she crowned. It is in the very idea that a woman, in a world built for men, could claim her place, not by permission, but by sheer force of will. She did not ask for power. She embodied it, and in the tapestry of medieval Europe, her thread runs long, golden, and unbroken. Eleanor of Aquitaine's legacy is not confined to stone tombs or faded scrolls. It lives on in the very shape of Europe, in the lineage of monarchs, and in the evolving idea of female power. She was a woman centuries ahead of her time, and her influence didn't end with her death. In fact, in many ways, it began to crystallize only after she was gone. Through her children and grandchildren, Eleanor's bloodline spread across the thrones of Europe. Her daughter Eleanor of England became Queen of Castile. Her granddaughter Blanche of Castile, the one she personally escorted to France, would become the mother of Louis IX, the future Saint Louis. And of course, her sons Richard and John left legacies of their own, though often marked by war, controversy, and legend. But beyond royal bloodlines, Eleanor reshaped the idea of what a queen could be. Before her, queens were often silent partners, pawns of dynastic marriage. Eleanor broke that mould. She was a landowner in her own right, a political strategist, a commander of troops, and at times, the effective ruler of an empire. Her courts in Aquitaine helped birth the concept of courtly love, a cultural movement that transformed medieval literature, music, and values. Her patronage encouraged poetry and philosophy in a time dominated by warfare and dogma. And perhaps most remarkably, she achieved all this in an age when women were expected to be submissive, silent, and invisible. Eleanor didn't just defy the rules, she rewrote them. She dared to lead armies on crusade, challenge her husband's authority, raise rebellious sons, and act as regent over a volatile kingdom. She was imprisoned for her defiance, but not broken. And when the world doubted her, she endured, waited, and returned to power with grace and fire. Today, historians see Eleanor not as an anomaly, but as a turning point, a symbol of medieval female agency that stood firm amid male-dominated monarchies. She wasn't perfect. She could be ruthless, politically calculating, and at times self-serving, but she was never irrelevant, never a shadow. She was a queen who ruled through intellect, charisma, and endurance, a mother who shaped kings, a duchess who defined empires. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just live through history, she made it. Centuries before the Mona Lisa smiled at tourists beneath soft museum lights, the Louvre was something else entirely. A fortress of stone and silence, built for defence, not display. Around the year 1190, King Philip II of France, anxious about English threats from the west, ordered the construction of a powerful stronghold along the Seine's edge. At that time, Paris was far smaller, and the western frontier of the city needed protection. What rose from the riverbank was not a palace or gallery, but a fortress, thick, grim, and impenetrable. This early Louvre was anchored by a massive circular keep, a tower 30 meters tall, surrounded by high curtain walls, watchtowers, and a broad, dry moat. It wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was practical. Cold stone, arrow slits, iron-reinforced gates. Beneath the fortress, secret tunnels and storage chambers were carved into the ground. Corridors meant for moving supplies, hiding troops, or escaping under siege. These tunnels, some historians believe, may still lie buried beneath modern Paris. For centuries, this fortress loomed over the Seine like a sleeping beast, quietly guarding the kingdom. But over time, its purpose began to fade. Paris expanded beyond its original walls. The city grew safer, and kings, no longer needing a garrison in the capital, began to look at the fortress differently. By the 1500s, it was considered outdated, militarily useless, but full of potential. Renaissance kings with visions of grandeur no longer wanted thick battlements. They wanted halls, galleries, gardens. The Louvre, though rough and ancient, stood in the right place, by the river, in the heart of Paris, close to power. It was time to reinvent it. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. The old fortress was slowly dismantled, reshaped, and incorporated into new royal plans. But the bones of that original medieval beast never fully disappeared. When renovations were done in the late 20th century, centuries after the museum had taken over, workers unearthed the buried base of Philip's Tower, cold, grey, and intact. Today, visitors can still descend into the Louvre's basement and stand among the stones that once guarded Paris, silent sentinels from a darker time. And beneath the polished marble and curated calm of the museum, the ghosts of a fortress still linger. By the early 16th century, the age of feudal wars had faded, and so had the need for castles within city walls. Kings no longer wanted to defend Paris with stone. They wanted to rule it with style. It was during the reign of King Francis I that the Louvre began its most dramatic transformation, from a military outpost to a seat of royal power and artistic ambition. Francis III had spent time in Italy and returned to France inspired by the Renaissance. He didn't just want a palace. He wanted a symbol of culture, sophistication, and modern monarchy. In 1546, he ordered the demolition of parts of the old medieval keep and began replacing it with elegant wings and ornamental facades. Italian architects were invited to Paris, and with them came a new aesthetic: arches, columns, and symmetry. The cold fortress slowly began to bloom into a palace, but Francis wasn't just building walls, he was building a collection. He brought Italian masterpieces back with him, including works by Leonardo da Vinci. The most famous, the Mona Lisa. Francis purchased it directly from da Vinci himself, and though it wouldn't be displayed to the public for centuries, the seeds of the Louvre's future were being quietly planted. His successors continued the work. Catherine de' Medici, widow of King Henry II, constructed the nearby Tuileries Palace and had grand ideas to link it with the Louvre. Her efforts set in motion what would become the massive palace complex stretching along the Seine. It became a symbol of the monarchy, sprawling, majestic, and ever-growing. By the time of Louis XIII and Louis XIV, the Louvre had taken on a dual personality, half residence, half artistic epicenter. Artists were invited to live and work in its halls. Sculptors, painters, and architects passed through its corridors, some even sleeping beneath their canvases. The Louvre was no longer just a home for kings. It had become a home for creativity. Yet even as elegance overtook utility, the palace remained politically potent. Behind its ornate walls, plots unfolded, alliances were forged, and power shifted hands. The Louvre was no longer built to keep enemies out. Now it was designed to dazzle them. As the Louvre evolved into a dazzling palace, it seemed destined to become the permanent heart of royal life in France. But in the 17th century, one man would change everything. Louis XIV, the Sun King. Ambitious, theatrical, and obsessed with control, Louis saw the Louvre as a relic of compromise, too urban, too cramped, too tangled in old aristocratic bloodlines. He wanted something grander, purer, and wholly his own. And so, in 1682, Louis XIV moved the royal court to Versailles. The shift was monumental. With that single decision, the Louvre's role as the centre of royal power ended. Its once glorious halls, lined with tapestries and filled with courtiers, were suddenly quiet. The king was gone. The nobility followed. And the Louvre, left behind in the capital, began to lose its lustre. But it didn't fall into decay. Instead, something unexpected happened. It began to open up. Without the constant presence of royalty, the Louvre became a haven for artists and intellectuals. Louis XIV, though absent, had a soft spot for the arts. He allowed the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture to take up residence in the building. Studios and workshops filled the vacant rooms. Painters and sculptors worked beside philosophers and mathematicians. The Louvre transformed into a living laboratory of French creativity. During this period, the Louvre's identity became more fluid. It was no longer a fortress, no longer a royal residence. It was something between. It housed administrative offices, academies, and salons. At times it was chaotic, a patchwork of projects and unfinished renovations. But beneath the confusion, a new idea was taking shape. That perhaps this former seat of kings could one day belong to the people. There were whispers of turning it into a public gallery, a place where ordinary citizens could see the treasures their taxes helped collect. But under the monarchy, the idea remained just that, a dream. Still, the seed was planted. The Louvre, stripped of royal glamour, began to acquire a new kind of prestige, one built not on crowns and courts, but on culture and knowledge. And as political storms gathered on the horizon of France, that cultural core would become more powerful than any throne. By the late 18th century, the storm that had long been brewing in France finally broke. The monarchy fell. The guillotine rose. And in the chaos of revolution, centuries of royal tradition were torn down, including the idea that art belonged only to kings. The Louvre, once a private pleasure palace of monarchs, stood on the brink of transformation. In 1793, as the French Revolution devoured the old order, the National Assembly declared that the Louvre would become the Muséum Central des Arts de la République, a public museum, free for all citizens. It was a radical concept. Art, previously hidden behind palace walls or reserved for the elite, would now be available to the common man. The first galleries opened on August 10th, the anniversary of the fall of the monarchy. The irony was not lost on anyone. Where kings once entertained mistresses and hosted masquerades, the people now walked in silence, observing canvases of saints, gods, and emperors. But the Louvre's collection needed more than just good intentions. Many masterpieces had been sold, stolen, or hidden during the revolution. So the revolutionaries did what revolutionaries often do. They took. Church property was confiscated. Aristocratic collections were seized. Anything that symbolized privilege was fair game. The Louvre became the great collector of confiscated beauty. And then came Napoleon. When he rose to power, the Louvre entered a new, ambitious phase. Napoleon saw art not just as culture, but as conquest. Wherever his armies marched, treasures followed. From Rome to Venice, Egypt to Berlin, Napoleon plundered paintings, statues, and antiquities. He renamed the museum the Musée Napoléon and filled it with loot from across Europe. The Louvre swelled with spoils, winged victories, Roman busts, Egyptian sarcophagi. Art was no longer just inherited, it was seized. And the museum, once a symbol of royal excess, now stood as a showcase of empire. But with Napoleon's fall in 1815 came a reckoning. Many nations demanded their treasures back. Some were returned. Others mysteriously stayed. Still, the Louvre survived. And more than that, it was reborn. No longer royal, no longer revolutionary. It had become something lasting. A monument not just to France, but to civilization itself. and beneath its marble floors, the layers of history continued to deepen. While the Louvre dazzled the world above ground, beneath its stone corridors and polished galleries lay another story, one of secrets, tunnels, and whispers lost to time. Few visitors know that beneath the museum's grandeur is a network of cellars, passageways, and forgotten vaults that speak to the building's centuries of transformation. Much of the underground space dates back to the original medieval fortress. When Philip II built the first Louvre in the 12th century, it included underground storerooms and escape tunnels carved into bedrock. Some were used to store arms and grain, others, it's believed, connected to the Seine for stealthy movements during times of siege. As the fortress became a palace and the palace became a museum, these passages were expanded, sealed, or repurposed. Some were converted into wine cellars during the Renaissance. Others were bricked up and abandoned, their existence remembered only in aging floor plans and royal letters. One particularly eerie structure is the remnants of the original moat, now part of the museum's basement exhibit. Visitors can walk along its cold stone edge, where the line between museum and ruin becomes thin. Here, the polished elegance of the Louvre gives way to raw medieval stone, crumbling, weathered, untouched by centuries of renovation. And then there are the rumours. Some say secret tunnels still lie hidden beneath the Louvre, remnants of royal escape routes or wartime shelters. During World War II, it's documented that certain rooms and underground passages were used to hide France's artistic treasures from Nazi looters. Paintings were crated and smuggled out, but not everything could be moved. Some relics were buried deep in the Louvre's belly, surrounded by stone, guarded by curators who knew every inch of the underground map. Others claim that during the Revolution, bodies of executed aristocrats were secretly stored in the lower levels, hidden from public view until they could be properly buried. No evidence confirms this, but the myth lingers in the Louvre's walls like an echo. Today, many of these lower levels are closed to the public. Some serve logistical purposes, archives, maintenance routes, climate control zones, but others remain sealed, inaccessible, their secrets intact. Beneath the Louvre's polished surface, the past still breathes, heavy with stories never displayed in frames. In June 1940, Paris fell under Nazi occupation. German troops marched through the city's boulevards, and the swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. The Louvre, the crown jewel of French heritage, stood ominously in the heart of it all, vulnerable, exposed, and filled with priceless art. What happened behind its grand doors during those dark years remains one of the most intense and covert chapters in the museum's long history. But the Louvre was not caught off guard. Even before the Germans entered the city, French curators and art historians had begun executing a secret evacuation plan. Thousands of works, including the Mona Lisa, the Venus de Milo, and the Winged Victory of Samothrace, were quietly removed, crated in custom-built boxes, and shipped to castles, abbeys, and rural estates throughout France. Convoys of trucks, disguised and escorted, carried away the nation's soul under the cover of night. It was the largest museum evacuation ever attempted. By the time Nazi officers arrived to inspect the Louvre, the galleries were eerily empty. What remained were decoy paintings, empty frames, and a skeleton staff. The Nazis, furious but impressed by the scale of the operation, repurposed the building for their own use. Some rooms were used as offices for the Kunstschutz, the Nazi division tasked with cataloguing and controlling Europe's cultural property. Meanwhile, the hidden masterpieces were constantly moved across the French countryside to evade detection. Museum staff risked their lives to preserve what they called the treasure. Some of them joined the resistance. Others faked documents, forged shipping orders, or misled collaborators. The Louvre, though silenced, was not passive. It became part of a cultural battlefield. By 1944, as the Allies approached, the Nazis began retreating and looting. French resistance members worked tirelessly to protect the hidden collections from being taken. When Paris was finally liberated in August, the museum's defenders emerged from the shadows, and the Louvre slowly began reclaiming its treasures. One by one, the great works returned to their home. Some had suffered, others had narrowly escaped destruction. But the Louvre had survived the war, not just as a building, but as a spirit. And in its quiet halls, you can still feel the weight of what was almost lost. By the late 20th century, the Louvre had become one of the most respected museums in the world, a guardian of civilization's greatest treasures. But beneath its grandeur, it was showing signs of strain. The galleries were crowded, the entrances outdated, and the layout confusing. The museum needed a transformation, and in 1981, French President François Mitterrand announced the most ambitious modernization in the Louvre's history. At the center of it all would be a glass pyramid. Designed by Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei, the project was bold, radical, and immediately divisive. The idea of placing a massive, modernist structure, made entirely of steel and glass, in the middle of the Louvre's historic courtyard sent shockwaves through France. Critics called it an eyesore, a scar on the face of French heritage. One newspaper infamously described it as a monstrosity that would defile the spirit of Paris. But Pei remained calm. He believed that the pyramid, with its geometric precision and transparency, would complement the classical beauty of the Louvre, not compete with it. And more importantly, it would serve a practical purpose. It would act as a grand central entrance, unifying the various wings of the sprawling complex. Construction began in 1984, and for years, the Louvre was a construction zone, full of scaffolding, noise, and controversy. Parisians grumbled, tourists were baffled, the press debated endlessly. But when the pyramid was finally unveiled in 1989, something unexpected happened. People began to change their minds. Beneath its sleek exterior, the new underground concourse was efficient, elegant, and flooded with natural light. For the first time, visitors could move through the museum with clarity. The pyramid became a beacon, both literal and symbolic, of the Louvre's openness to the future. Today, it is almost impossible to imagine the Louvre without it. The glass structure has become iconic, featured in films, books, and photographs worldwide. What was once mocked as architectural heresy is now embraced as visionary design. The pyramid did more than modernize the museum. It reminded the world that the Louvre had always been about transformation, from fortress to palace, from palace to museum, from past to present. And as always, beneath its elegance, controversy whispered, just as it always had. For all its beauty and brilliance, the Louvre also holds shadows. Stories of stolen treasures, missing masterpieces, and mysteries that have never been solved. As the museum grew in size and prestige, so did its collection. But not all of its pieces arrived by honest means. Some of the museum's earliest acquisitions came through seizure. During the French Revolution, artworks were taken from churches and aristocratic estates. During Napoleon's campaigns, the plundering became systematic. His armies swept through Europe and North Africa, stripping palaces and temples of statues, sarcophagi, and paintings. Many of these items were proudly displayed in the Louvre, renamed the Musée Napoléon, as trophies of empire. Though some were returned after his fall, others remained. Today, debates continue over the rightful ownership of many of the museum's most prized pieces. Greece has long demanded the return of certain antiquities. Egypt, too, has pressed for the repatriation of statues taken during colonial excavations. The Louvre's Egyptian collection, one of the largest outside of Cairo, remains a source of pride and quiet controversy. But theft didn't stop in the 19th century. In 1911, the Louvre experienced its most infamous heist. The Mona Lisa, yes, that Mona Lisa, vanished from the wall. At first, no one noticed. The painting had been modestly displayed, and when it disappeared, museum staff assumed it had been taken for cleaning. It wasn't until the next day that panic set in. The investigation was chaotic, Even Picasso was brought in for questioning. But the real thief was Vincenzo Peruggia, an Italian handyman who believed the painting should be returned to Italy. He had hidden inside the museum overnight, slipped the painting under his coat, and walked out the next morning. It took 2 years to recover the painting, which was found in Florence. There have been other losses too, some small, some devastating. A royal crown disappeared during the 19th century. A priceless Egyptian stele was damaged in transport. Some artworks taken during Nazi occupation were never returned to their rightful owners. The Louvre, like all great institutions, carries the weight of its past, glorious and flawed. For every masterpiece on its walls, there is a trail of hands, choices, and consequences. Some treasures shine in the light. Others remain hidden in the cracks of history. Today, the Louvre stands as more than a museum. It is a living organism, constantly evolving, shaped by centuries of ambition, conquest, revolution, and reinvention. Over 10 million visitors pass through its doors each year, wandering through over 650,000 square feet of galleries, peering at faces frozen in oil, marble, and time. But the Louvre's magic is not just in its masterpieces. It's in the weight of its past, the layering of eras beneath its floors and behind its walls. Every step through the museum is a journey through overlapping centuries, where medieval stone corridors lie just below neoclassical facades, and digital screens share space with ancient relics. In this palace of paradoxes, Renaissance paintings hang beneath LED lighting, while Egyptian mummies sleep beneath Parisian sky. What makes the Louvre remarkable is its refusal to stay still. New wings are opened, old collections are reimagined. Temporary exhibitions bring contemporary voices into conversation with history. In 2012, the museum inaugurated a new Islamic art department, housed beneath a flowing golden canopy, a striking blend of ancient tradition and modern design. But the Louvre also expands beyond its own walls. In 2017, the Louvre Abu Dhabi opened, a cultural collaboration between France and the United Arab Emirates. Its architecture mirrored the light and shadow of the original, but the vision was global. Artworks from around the world were displayed together, untethered from national borders, telling stories that spanned continents and civilizations. Yet even with all this growth, the heart of the Louvre remains the same, a place where memory and imagination meet. Walk through its corridors late in the day and you'll see more than tourists. You'll see quiet moments, a child staring into the eyes of a statue, a student sketching a forgotten corner, an elderly couple standing hand in hand before a canvas, and below it all, under the glass pyramid, behind the velvet ropes, beyond the gallery lights, the Louvre still keeps its secrets. Hidden staircases, lost chambers, and perhaps, somewhere in the quiet dust of its oldest stones, the echo of a king or the whisper of a thief. The Louvre isn't just a museum. It's a memory palace, built on centuries of ambition and still writing its story. In the spring of 1974, outside the ancient city of Xi'an in China's Shanxi province, a small group of farmers were digging a well during a drought. Their tools struck something hard, not rock, but clay. First came fragments, a torso, a pair of arms, then a face staring back at them through layers of soil. It was unnerving, life-sized, hollow, yet hauntingly real. The local authorities were alerted, and soon archaeologists arrived to investigate. They had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the 20th century. As excavations expanded, the earth yielded more than anyone could have imagined. Row after row of clay soldiers emerged from the soil, thousands of them standing in precise military formation, frozen in time for over 2,000 years. Each one was unique. Different hairstyles, armor styles, facial expressions. No two were exactly alike. Some stood tall with commanding presence, others crouched in attack stance, and they weren't alone. Clay horses, wooden chariots, and bronze weapons accompanied them, all crafted with startling realism. What had these figures been guarding for so long beneath the ground? The answer lay not far away, beneath an unexcavated mound over 250 feet high, the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. It was he who ordered this massive underground army built, not for the battlefield, but for the afterlife. The terracotta army was part of a sprawling necropolis, a buried empire designed to mirror the emperor's real-world domain. Scholars estimate that over 700,000 workers may have been involved in its construction over nearly 4 decades, and incredibly, this massive wonder lay untouched and forgotten for more than 2,000 years. News of the discovery spread quickly, and the world was captivated. Here was not just a tomb, but a window into ancient Chinese philosophy, artistry, power, and belief. A civilization had poured its skill and resources into preparing one man for eternity, with an army that would never breathe, but would always stand. Yet the mystery was only beginning. Who made these soldiers? How were they crafted with such detail? And what secrets were buried alongside them, still untouched beneath the emperor's tomb? At the heart of the terracotta army lies a single man's vision, a ruler whose ambition was matched only by his fear of death. Qin Shi Huang, born in 259 BCE, rose from prince to king, and finally to China's first emperor. He unified the warring states under one banner, standardized currency, language, and even axle lengths. But while his power shaped a nation, it was his obsession with the afterlife that shaped the underground empire he left behind. From a young age, Qin was haunted by the idea of mortality. Despite ruling with an iron fist and achieving what no other had, the unification of China, he could not conquer death. Ancient texts describe his relentless search for immortality, expeditions sent in search of elixirs, meetings with mystics, consultations with alchemists. He was said to ingest strange potions containing mercury, ironically believed to grant eternal life. But while immortality in flesh eluded him, Qin ensured he would rule forever in spirit. Around the time he declared himself emperor in 221 BCE, construction began on his tomb, an undertaking so massive it would take nearly 4 decades to complete. Unlike traditional tombs, which featured burial goods and ritual objects, Qin envisioned a subterranean kingdom. Not symbols of power, but power itself. Armies, officials, entertainers, and even rivers of mercury to simulate the geography of his empire. The terracotta army was meant to serve as his eternal guard, soldiers to protect him in the afterlife, as they would have in life. But these were not crude idols. They were masterworks, crafted with obsessive realism, their stances and weapons reflecting actual military ranks and formations. This was not merely a monument to greatness, it was a response to fear. The fear of being alone in death, of wandering the underworld without defense or dignity. For Qin Shi Huang, eternity required preparation, and he would command an army that could not die. Ironically, the emperor's quest for eternal life may have hastened his death. The mercury-laced elixirs he took likely poisoned him. He died in 210 BCE at just 49 years old, still searching for the secret to escape time. But in a strange way, he succeeded. His body perished, but his army still stands. The terracotta army is not just impressive because of its scale. It's the precision, individuality, and artistry of each soldier that leave archaeologists and historians in awe. When we say there are thousands of soldiers, we don't mean copies from a mold. Each one is unique, as if frozen mid-step, mid-thought, mid-breath. The army is divided into different pits, each with its own composition and function. The largest, Pit 1, stretches over 750 feet in length and contains infantry units in battle-ready formation. Rows of archers, foot soldiers, and charioteers stand at attention, arranged in the same military order used during Qin Shi Huang's reign. Pit 2 holds cavalry and war chariots, a more elite force. Pit 3 is the command center, home to high-ranking officers and military planners. It suggests a chain of command that mirrors a real army, not a symbolic one. The level of detail is staggering. Faces are individualized. No two noses, brows, or cheekbones are the same. Some figures have wide jaws and curled lips. Others wear solemn, narrow expressions. Hairstyles reflect military rank and regional origin. Armor is crafted in overlapping layers, complete with rivets and clasps. Some figures once held real bronze weapons, spears, swords, and crossbows, many of which were sharp and functional even after 2 millennia underground. It wasn't just sculptors who worked on these figures. Teams of artisans, painters, blacksmiths, mold makers, and engineers contributed to their creation. After assembly, each warrior was painted in vivid colours: red, blue, green, even lavender. These pigments faded quickly when exposed to air, which is why most figures appear plain clay brown today. But imaging technology has revealed the original brilliance, offering a glimpse of how vibrant and lifelike this army once looked. Some scholars believe the level of sophistication suggests a high degree of central planning, possibly with military blueprints and social registers guiding the design. This wasn't art for art's sake. This was logistical, purposeful, a vision executed with state-level resources. The terracotta army wasn't just made to resemble soldiers, it was made to be them, each one a spirit in clay, crafted to serve their emperor in eternity. And beneath the silence of the earth, they've been standing guard ever since. The creation of the terracotta army was not the work of a few artists in a royal workshop. It was a colossal, state-sponsored operation that stretched over decades and involved an entire society. Ancient records suggest that more than 700,000 labourers were mobilised to build Emperor Qin Shi Huang's tomb complex, including the vast subterranean army that stood beside him. But who were these builders? They were craftsmen. Yes, sculptors, blacksmiths, potters, and engineers, but also conscripted workers, peasants, prisoners, and even enslaved people. Some were skilled artisans, trained in workshops across the empire. Others were political prisoners and forced labourers brought to Xi'an under imperial orders. Many never returned home. According to historical texts, workers involved in the tomb's construction were often executed or sealed within the complex upon its completion to maintain secrecy. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of kilns near the site, suggesting that many of the figures were fired on location. The clay was sourced locally, shaped in parts, and then assembled like life-sized puzzles. Bodies were mass-produced using moulds, but the heads, the most expressive parts, were sculpted individually by hand. This allowed for variation in features, lending a realism unmatched by any other ancient statuary army. But this was not just about statues. The labour force also carved out an entire underground city. In addition to the warriors, they constructed chambers filled with bronze birds, chariots, entertainers, musicians, and officials, all meant to serve the emperor in the afterlife. The tomb complex spans over 50 square kilometres and includes artificial rivers, celestial ceilings, and booby-trapped corridors that were likely designed to kill grave robbers. According to historian Sima Qian, writing a century after Qin's death, the emperor ordered rare jewels to adorn the tomb's ceiling to mimic the stars and flowing rivers of mercury to replicate China's geography. Soil samples from the site do, in fact, show abnormally high levels of mercury, suggesting the legends were rooted in truth. The builders of this empire worked in secrecy and under constant surveillance. Their legacy is buried in silence. Most of their names are lost, but their hands shaped one of the greatest wonders of ancient engineering, an entire kingdom buried not to be forgotten, but to endure. At the centre of the terracotta army site lies a massive tree-covered mound, a hill that looks like any other from a distance. But beneath it rests the unexcavated tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang himself, untouched for over 2,000 years. It is one of the greatest archaeological mysteries still waiting beneath the surface. Historical accounts, particularly from the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, describe the tomb as nothing short of otherworldly. Inside, he claimed, were replicas of palaces and towers, rare artifacts, flowing rivers of mercury to represent China's great waterways, and a ceiling encrusted with pearls to mimic the night sky. Crossbows were supposedly rigged with automatic triggers, ready to fire on any intruder who dared enter. A buried universe crafted entirely for one man's afterlife. And yet, no one has opened it. Unlike the terracotta warriors, which have been extensively studied and preserved since their discovery, the main burial chamber remains sealed. Why? The reasons are both practical and ethical. For one, the technology needed to excavate the tomb without damaging its contents simply does not exist yet. Archaeologists fear that once the tomb is opened, priceless artifacts, including fragile paintings, textiles, or organic materials, could be destroyed upon exposure to air. The terracotta warriors themselves lost their vibrant paint within hours of being unearthed, turning from dazzling figures to dull clay. Then there is the matter of mercury. Soil tests around the mound show elevated levels of mercury, lending credibility to the ancient texts. If true, the tomb may pose serious environmental and health risks. Some speculate that it's not only hazardous to excavate, but also deliberately engineered to deter grave robbers, with traps and toxic fumes waiting in the dark. Culturally, there is reverence to consider. In traditional Chinese beliefs, disturbing the dead, especially an emperor, is a serious matter. Many argue that the tomb should remain untouched, unless it can be entered with absolute respect and preservation. And so, it waits. Beneath that quiet hill lies a secret that no one has seen in over 2,000 years. A world built for a man who could not conquer death, but who may have created a paradise to rule in it. And as science advances, the question grows louder. Should we open the tomb of the first emperor? The terracotta warriors are not simply statues. They are soldiers, and like any soldiers, they were equipped for war. Many of the warriors once held real weapons: swords, spears, halberds, crossbows, and arrows. Weapons not merely decorative, but functional, forged with deadly precision. This wasn't symbolic craftsmanship. These were tools of war, buried in clay hands as part of a full-scale military simulation for the afterlife. When archaeologists first excavated the pits, they found thousands of bronze weapons buried alongside the figures, swords with razor-sharp edges, arrowheads crafted for distance and penetration, and even crossbow triggers made with ingenious mechanical designs. Despite being over 2,000 years old, many of these weapons remained in surprisingly good condition. Some blades were still sharp, their bronze alloy so advanced that it resisted corrosion for millennia. How did they do it? Recent studies revealed that the ancient Chinese blacksmiths coated many of the weapons with a thin layer of chromium oxide, a technique that essentially prevented rust. This technology wouldn't be reinvented until the 20th century, and yet the Qin dynasty artisans had already mastered it. Their understanding of metallurgy was far ahead of its time, evidence of a highly organized and technologically skilled society. But the weapons also served a deeper purpose. Qin Shi Huang didn't just want a lifelike army, he wanted a lethal one. These warriors were meant to fight off threats in the afterlife just as his real troops had fought during his conquests. This wasn't a peaceful vision of eternity, it was a prepared one. The emperor intended to rule in death as he had in life, with force, strategy, and the means to dominate. Interestingly, many of the weapons were missing by the time modern archaeologists uncovered the site. It's believed that shortly after the emperor's death, the tomb was raided or sabotaged by revolting workers or enemies of the regime. Fires were set, roofs collapsed, and weapons were stolen. Even in death, Qin's empire faced rebellion. Still, enough remains to paint a vivid picture. A silent army, armed and alert, standing in formation beneath the soil, each warrior once ready to march, not in this world, but in the one beyond. While the terracotta warriors are the most famous part of Emperor Qin Shi Huang's burial complex, they were far from the only figures created. Beyond the battle-ready soldiers stood entire casts of characters, a full miniature society crafted in clay, all designed to serve the emperor in his eternal realm. Archaeologists have uncovered figures of musicians, dancers, acrobats, and strongmen, each one sculpted with the same meticulous care as the warriors, though their roles were far different. Instead of armor, they wore robes. Instead of weapons, they held musical instruments or posed mid-performance. These were the entertainers of the afterlife, created to amuse and delight a ruler who wanted his underground world to be just as lively as the one above. Officials and court attendants were also buried nearby, identifiable by their formal dress and composed postures. They represented the emperor's bureaucracy, advisors, scribes, and governors, all ready to keep order beyond the veil of death. Even stable hands, cooks, and grooms were included, depicted in kneeling or working poses, their faces captured with humility and fatigue. Then there were the animals. Terracotta horses stood beside wooden chariots, once painted and decorated. Underground stables revealed that not just sculptures, but real sacrificed horses may have once been buried for the emperor's use. In other pits, bronze waterfowl, cranes, geese, and ducks were found arranged along an artificial riverbed, suggesting that Qin's desire for replication extended even to nature itself. Each discovery added layers to the complexity of the tomb. This wasn't just a military installation, it was an empire beneath the earth, complete with its own court, culture, and daily rhythm. Scholars believe the intent was clear. Qin Shi Huang wanted to recreate the world he had conquered in life, and rule it forever in death. And while the warriors march in silence, these forgotten figures offer something softer, more human. They remind us that this afterlife wasn't imagined as endless warfare alone. It was filled with music, ceremony, and the tireless hum of a royal court. They may not carry swords or wear armor, but they too were built to serve the first emperor, and they too have waited in darkness for over 2,000 years. The Terracotta Army is more than an archaeological marvel. It is a mirror of an empire at its peak. Every clay figure reflects the scale, ambition, and structure of Qin Shi Huang's unified China. His dynasty was short-lived, lasting only 15 years, but its legacy reshaped the nation. And nowhere is that transformation more hauntingly captured than in the emperor's underground army. Before Qin's reign, China was a fractured land of warring states, 7 major kingdoms constantly fighting for supremacy. Qin, the westernmost of these states, was considered a cultural outsider by some, but it had something the others lacked: ruthless efficiency. Under Qin Shi Huang, legalist policies tightened control, roads were standardized, writing systems unified, and the foundations for the Great Wall began. The Terracotta Army reflects that same structure and discipline. Soldiers are arranged in precise formations, officers in front, infantry behind, archers on the flanks. The figures even vary by region, as if modelled after real troops drawn from across the empire. It wasn't just about guarding a tomb, it was about representing the machinery of the state itself. In many ways, the army is a frozen moment, a still life of Qin's authority at its height. Yet, it's also a cautionary tale. Because despite all his achievements, Qin Shi Huang's rule was deeply feared. He burned books, banned dissent, and punished opposition with death. His obsession with control extended even into death, and the very monument that was meant to celebrate his immortality would eventually become a silent witness to the fall of his dynasty. Just 3 years after his death, the Qin Empire collapsed. Rebellions erupted. His tomb was raided. His son committed suicide. And the Han dynasty rose in its place, leaving the once feared legacy of the Qin to be buried, literally and politically, beneath centuries of dust. And yet, centuries later, those silent warriors emerged again. Today, they speak not just of one man's fear of death, but of a civilization's vast reach and relentless ambition. The Terracotta Army stands not only as a tribute to the emperor who dreamed of ruling the afterlife, but as a timeless echo of a moment when all of China bowed to one throne. The Terracotta Army still stands in silence, row after row, decade after decade, watching, waiting. Not for war, not for conquest, but for remembrance. They are guardians not just of a tomb, but of a moment when a man believed he could take the world with him beyond death. Emperor Qin Shi Huang dreamed of immortality. He united warring kingdoms, reshaped a nation, and spent his final years preparing for an afterlife where he would still rule. He did not settle for symbolic offerings or ritual artifacts. He built an empire beneath the ground, staffed, armed and ordered, just like the one above. And though centuries passed, earthquakes shook the earth, and dynasties rose and fell, his creation endured. Beneath layers of soil and silence, the warriors waited. They bore the weight of time with cracked shoulders and faded paint, but their presence never weakened. Today, more than 2,000 years later, they are no longer buried. They stand under museum lights, beneath protective canopies and curious eyes. But their purpose is unchanged. They are still watching, still guarding, and perhaps still waiting for their emperor to rise. The Terracotta Army is one of the few places in the world where the boundary between life and death feels thin, where stone stares back as if it remembers. Walking among them is not like visiting an exhibit. It's like entering a kingdom in pause, a theatre where the curtain never rises, but the actors remain frozen in readiness. Archaeologists continue to uncover new figures, new chambers, new secrets. Each layer reveals more of the emperor's vision and more of his fear. Because, for all his power, Qin Shi Huang could not defeat death. But in building something meant to last forever, he created a legacy that transcended time. The terracotta warriors were not meant to be seen. But now that they belong to the world, not just as relics of ancient China, but as reminders of what it means to dream of eternity. They stand not in battle, but in witness to the man who tried to take it all with him. And in a way, perhaps, he did. More. Long before scripts were written or stages constructed, the origins of theatre in ancient Greece began in the soil of religion. It wasn't born as entertainment, but as ritual, a sacred offering to the gods, and most of all, to Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and ecstatic transformation. To understand theatre's beginning, you must picture hillsides, open skies, and communities gathered not for spectacle, but for communion. In the earliest days, people didn't watch performances, they participated in them. Rural festivals held in Dionysus's honor featured drinking, dancing, music, and ecstatic celebration. But at the heart of these gatherings were the dithyrambs, wild, passionate choral hymns sung by groups of 50 men or boys. These were no tame songs. The singers moved in unison, chanting, swaying, invoking the presence of the god. It was a ritual meant to transport, to unite mortals with the divine through rhythm, voice, and movement. Over time, these dithyrambic performances grew more structured. The chants began to incorporate storytelling elements, tales of Dionysus' birth, his wanderings, his suffering, and his joy. As the narratives became more complex, one performer began to step out from the chorus. This solo voice would engage in dialogue with the chorus, creating tension, emotion, and the earliest form of dramatic exchange. This innovation is often credited to Thespis of Icaria, a 6th century BCE performer who is said to be the first person to step away from the chorus and assume the role of an individual character. In doing so, Thespis transformed ritual into drama. He didn't just sing about a god, he became the god, or the hero, or the mortal in conflict. From this moment, theatre began to emerge from the mist of religious tradition into something distinct, a performed story with characters, emotion, and conflict. But in its earliest form, Greek theatre remained inseparable from worship. The stage was a sacred space. The audience was not merely entertained. They were participants in a collective act of reverence, catharsis, and transformation. Theatre, in its infancy, was not an art form for fame. It was a mirror held up to the divine, a place where gods spoke through human voices and mortals danced on the edge of mystery. By the 6th century BCE, Athens had begun to grow from a modest city-state into a cultural force, and at the centre of its artistic explosion stood the City Dionysia, a festival that would become the cradle of Western drama. Held each spring in honour of Dionysus Eleutherius, this festival blended devotion and spectacle. It lasted several days, and during that time, Athens transformed. Streets filled with music, wine flowed freely, and the city paused its usual business. Citizens, foreigners, politicians, and commoners all took part. It was more than celebration, it was civic unity, where religion, politics, and art converged. Central to the Dionysia was the theatrical competition. Tragedians would submit tetralogies, 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play, to be performed in front of a jury. The performances were not casual affairs. They were staged in massive open-air theatres, carved into hillsides, with thousands in attendance. The playwrights competed for prestige, but also to honour the god. Winning at Dionysia wasn't just about fame, it was a divine offering. The performances began at dawn and lasted all day. Each trilogy explored themes of human suffering, divine justice, fate, and morality. The audience, seated in a semicircular arrangement, watched actors in elaborate masks and robes perform tales of gods, kings, and doomed heroes. These stories were familiar, drawn from myth, but they were told with intensity, designed to move the soul. The chorus remained a vital presence, providing narration, commentary, and emotional resonance. Between scenes, they sang and danced, helping the audience interpret the unfolding drama. Music, movement, and dialogue wove together into something more than a play. It was a sacred experience, a ritual of collective catharsis. Even the state supported these events. The wealthy were required to sponsor productions as a civic duty, and tickets were subsidized so that even the poor could attend. This wasn't just art, it was democracy in motion. The City Dionysia transformed performance into an institution. It gave structure to the chaos of ritual and turned storytelling into a public mirror, one that reflected human weakness, divine wrath, and moral struggle. And through this sacred competition, theatre was born. Out of song and ceremony came something darker, deeper, and more enduring, tragedy. The word itself, tragoedia, means goat song, likely tied to ancient rituals where a goat was sacrificed to Dionysus. But by the 5th century BCE, tragedy had evolved into the cornerstone of Athenian theatre, a genre unlike anything the world had seen. Greek tragedy wasn't just a sad story, it was a spiritual dissection, a journey into fate, guilt, honour, and the terrifying uncertainty of divine will. At its heart was a tragic hero, a figure often of noble birth, who struggled against forces greater than himself. He might be a king, a warrior, or even a god-touched mortal, but always he would fall, brought down by a flaw, a decision, or an encounter with the inevitable. What made tragedy powerful wasn't just the fall itself, but the tension between human choice and cosmic fate. These plays forced audiences to ask, are we free or are we doomed? Is suffering random or deserved? And can anyone truly escape the will of the gods? 3 playwrights emerged as the titans of this form: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Aeschylus, the earliest of the 3, added a second actor to the stage, a breakthrough that allowed true dialogue. His works are majestic, solemn, and filled with moral gravity. He saw divine justice as complex, often harsh, but ultimately restoring balance. His Oresteia trilogy traces a family cursed by murder, vengeance, and blood, ending only when divine justice replaces personal revenge. Sophocles refined tragedy further, adding a third actor and expanding character depth. His Oedipus Rex remains the quintessential tragedy, a man trying to escape his fate, only to run headlong into it. Sophocles painted his characters with more humanity, showing their inner conflict, pride, and helplessness. Euripides, the most controversial, pushed the genre toward realism. His characters were raw, flawed, and unpredictable. He questioned the gods, highlighted the suffering of women and the marginalized, and made tragedy more personal, more painful. Through tragedy, Greek theatre became a moral arena, not just a performance, but a confrontation. Audiences didn't leave entertained. They left shaken, purged, and awed. Because tragedy didn't just show the fall of a hero, it revealed the fragility of all human striving, and reminded every viewer suffering is universal, and no one is exempt. While tragedy explored the darkness of fate and the weight of the divine, comedy emerged as its irreverent twin, wild, loud, and often scandalous. Where tragedy sought catharsis through suffering, comedy brought release through laughter, a vital counterbalance to the heaviness of Athenian life and ritual. Greek comedy, like tragedy, grew from religious festivals, especially the Dionysia and the Lenaea, another celebration of Dionysus held in winter. In its earliest form, comedy was anarchic and obscene, filled with crude jokes, parodies, and songs that mocked politicians, philosophers, and even the gods. But it wasn't mindless humour. Greek comedy was satirical, sharp-edged, and boldly political. The earliest and most famous playwright of this genre was Aristophanes, a master of what we now call old comedy. His plays featured fantasy, absurdity, and direct attacks on public figures. In The Clouds, he lampooned Socrates as a foolish sophist. In Lysistrata, he imagined women ending a war by withholding intimacy from their husbands. And in The Frogs, he sent Dionysus himself to the underworld to judge a contest between dead tragedians. Aristophanes' plays often broke the fourth wall. The chorus would turn to the audience and deliver a parabasis, a direct address that blurred the lines between fiction and public discourse. Nothing was off limits. War, corruption, philosophy, and even the theatrical competitions themselves were all fodder for ridicule. But beneath the raunchy humour and surreal plots, Greek comedy served a deeper function. It was a space where society could laugh at itself, speak truth to power, and explore taboo topics in a communal setting. In a democracy like Athens, where public opinion mattered, comedy was a form of release, a collective pressure valve. As Athens changed, so did comedy. Later, in the 4th century BCE, the rise of new comedy introduced more refined, character-driven stories. Playwrights like Menander shifted focus from gods and politics to family, love, and everyday life. These comedies would later influence Roman writers like Plautus and Terence, and eventually the modern sitcom. Greek comedy gave voice to joy, frustration, and rebellion. It showed that in a society grappling with war, death, and destiny, laughter was not escape, but survival. And just as tragedy revealed the human fall, comedy celebrated the human fool, joyful, flawed, and defiantly alive. In ancient Greece, the theatre was more than a venue. It was a sacred space, both religious and civic, where the community gathered not just to be entertained, but to be transformed. Performances weren't staged in anonymous buildings. They unfolded in massive open-air amphitheatres, carved into the hillsides, always facing nature, the sky above, the sea or city in the distance, and the gods watching from beyond. The most famous of these was the Theatre of Dionysus in Athens, located on the southern slope of the Acropolis. It could seat up to 17,000 spectators, citizens, metics, foreign residents, and visitors alike. From its marble tiers, the audience could see and be seen. This mattered. Attending theatre was a public act, a civic duty, and a ritual all at once. At the heart of the theatre was the orchestra, a circular dancing floor where the chorus would move and sing. Behind it stood the skene, a building used as a backdrop, dressing area, and symbol of place, palace, temple, or battlefield. The actors performed on a raised platform called the proskenion, and behind them loomed the sacred altar to Dionysus. Every play was performed in his honour. But what truly made the theatre sacred wasn't just its structure, it was its purpose. Drama was a communal experience meant to stir the soul, to confront the audience with their fears, beliefs, and responsibilities. As they watched kings fall or fools triumph, the spectators weren't just observers. They were participants in a ritual of catharsis, emotional purification through pity and fear. The festival itself opened with sacrifices and processions. Statues of Dionysus were paraded through the city. The playwrights were not just artists. They were competing priests, offering their stories as sacred acts. And the audience? They were witnesses to something divine unfolding through human voices. This connection between sacred and civic was powerful. Political leaders, generals, and jurors all sat in the front rows. Democracy and drama shared the same stage. In the theatre, Athenians faced their myths, their morals, and their mortality together. The Greek theatre was never just about actors and applause. It was a temple of the human condition, where every laugh, gasp, and tear was a prayer to the gods of chaos, wisdom, and fate. In the theatres of ancient Greece, where thousands gathered in open air and no microphones existed, how could a single actor command attention? The answer lies in the art of performance, a fusion of mask, movement, and sound that transformed individuals into mythic figures, projecting emotion and character across vast space. At the centre of this transformation was the mask. Crafted from lightweight materials like linen, cork, or wood, masks covered the entire face, often with exaggerated expressions. A wide open mouth for sorrow, an arched brow for rage, a smirk for mischief. Each design amplified the emotional tone of the character. Since only a few actors played multiple roles, the mask also allowed for rapid shifts in identity. One moment, a king. The next, a god or a slave. Masks weren't just practical. They were sacred tools, linking the actor to the spirit of the role. To wear a mask wasn't merely to pretend, it was to embody. The actor became a vessel, channeling not only character, but fate, myth, and message. Costumes were equally important. Robes were brightly coloured and stylized, helping define a character's role: royalty, warrior, servant, or fool. High platform shoes, called kothurni, elevated tragic actors, lending them a towering, otherworldly presence. In contrast, comedic actors wore padded suits and grotesque masks, exaggerating belly, backside, and facial features for laughs. Movement was grand and deliberate. Without close-ups or spoken nuance, actors used sweeping gestures and choreographed steps to express emotion. Every pose mattered. Every turn carried weight. And then, there was sound. The chorus, positioned in the orchestra, sang and chanted in unison, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic layer of storytelling. Flutes accompanied the action, enhancing suspense, sorrow, or triumph. The human voice, trained and projected, rang out over the rows of stone seats, resonating through the marble bowl of the theatre. Together, mask, costume, motion, and sound formed a ritualized language of performance. It wasn't about realism, it was about essence, distilling human experience into bold, symbolic action. In Greek theatre, the actor was not a star, but a servant of the story, shaped by myth, driven by voice, and veiled in the haunting power of the mask. In the heart of every ancient Greek drama stood the chorus, a group that was neither lead actor nor passive audience, but something in between. They did not simply watch the story unfold. They sang it, danced it, questioned it, and mourned it. The chorus was the soul of the performance, a bridge between mortals and gods, stage and spectators. Traditionally composed of 12 to 15 men in tragedy and up to 24 in comedy, the chorus performed in the orchestra, the circular dancing floor at the base of the stage. Their movements were carefully choreographed, and their songs, known as odes or stasima, were set to the tones of the aulos, a double-reeded flute that gave the music its distinct haunting resonance. But what did the chorus do? They offered commentary on the action, posed moral questions, and voiced the thoughts that the characters themselves could not say. If the hero made a fatal choice, the chorus might whisper doubt. If a god intervened, the chorus interpreted its meaning. They echoed the audience's own reactions: fear, pity, outrage, wonder, but with poetry and rhythm that elevated the response into something nearly divine. Sometimes the chorus acted as a kind of collective conscience. In Oedipus Rex, they beg the king to listen to reason, sensing doom before it falls. In Antigone, they struggle to choose between law and justice. In the Bacchae, they represent the ecstatic followers of Dionysus, joyful, dangerous, and devoted. Their function wasn't always solemn. In comedy, the chorus could be loud, rude, and wildly inappropriate. They might interrupt the action, mock the audience, or even deliver a parabasis, a direct address to the crowd, often expressing the playwright's own views on politics, art, or society. What made the chorus powerful wasn't just what they said, but how they said it, in unified movement and voice. They were a living metaphor, the many speaking as one, reflecting not just personal opinion, but collective identity. In a world where fate and the gods ruled all, the chorus reminded every theatre-goer of their place in the grand design, as witness, as questioner, and as voice for the voiceless. In Athens, the birthplace of both theatre and democracy, drama was not just an art form, it was a civic institution. The theatre was where the city came together, not only to witness myths and legends, but to confront itself, its values, its fears, its failures. It was a space where storytelling and citizenship intertwined. The annual festivals, especially the City Dionysia, were funded and attended by the state. Wealthy citizens were appointed as chourgoi, responsible for financing productions as a form of public service. The best plays were selected by magistrates, performed in front of thousands, and judged by a panel of citizen jurors. The process was formal, competitive, and deeply Athenian. Why was this important? Because the stories on stage were never just about ancient heroes or faraway gods. They were reflections of the present, moral and political allegories that held a mirror up to the city itself. When Sophocles staged Antigone, he wasn't just telling a myth about a stubborn king. He was asking his fellow Athenians, when does the law serve justice, and when does it become tyranny? When Euripides wrote about war-torn women in the Trojan Women, he was echoing the recent devastation of Athens' own military campaigns. Even comedy got political. Aristophanes lampooned leaders, questioned wars, and ridiculed philosophers. Audiences laughed, but the questions lingered. Who are we following? What are we becoming? Attendance at the theatre was not passive. Citizens were expected to go, reflect, and engage. Tickets were often subsidized by the state, so even the poorest Athenians could attend. The belief was clear. A healthy democracy requires a thoughtful public, and theatre helped cultivate that thought. Plays did more than entertain. They educated, provoked, united, and challenged. They turned myth into message and stage into statecraft. Every gasp, every cheer, every silence carried civic weight. In a city built on public voice, the theatre was its echo chamber, a place where freedom of thought could dance with divine myth, and where every citizen sat not just as spectator, but as participant in the moral life of the polis. Though the golden age of Greek theatre faded with the fall of classical Athens, its legacy never disappeared. What began as ritual and evolved into tragedy and comedy would echo across millennia, shaping the very foundation of Western storytelling. After the Peloponnesian War and the rise of Macedon, Athenian theatre declined in political power, but remained a cultural force. Hellenistic playwrights, like Menander, shifted the focus from gods and fate to everyday life, romantic entanglements, mistaken identities, and domestic struggles. These new comedies would later influence Roman dramatists, such as Plautus and Terence, whose plays laid the groundwork for Renaissance and modern farce. Roman theatre absorbed much from the Greeks, their structure, their characters, even their language. but the deeper influence ran through time. When Shakespeare wrote of tragic heroes brought down by their flaws, or when Molière mocked society through biting wit, the spirit of Sophocles and Aristophanes was alive again. Even today, echoes of ancient Greek drama are everywhere. The three-act structure, so common in modern storytelling, mirrors the progression of Greek tragedy. The very idea of catharsis, introduced by Aristotle, remains at the heart of powerful narrative. That deep emotional release we feel when a story reflects our own struggles and contradictions. The architecture of modern theatres, the use of masks in performance art, and even the concept of the chorus in musicals all trace their roots to those open-air amphitheatres carved into the hills of ancient Greece. But perhaps the greatest legacy is not found in structure, but in purpose. Greek theatre asked questions we are still asking. What is justice? What is fate? What does it mean to be human in a world ruled by forces beyond our control? It gave voice to grief, joy, defiance, and absurdity. It reminded citizens that power must answer to truth, and that laughter could be as revolutionary as rage. What began as songs to a god of wine and ecstasy became a timeless art form, one that continues to illuminate our lives, not with easy answers, but with stories that dare to ask the hardest questions. The stage may have changed, the voices may be new, but the drama, the conflict, the wonder, that is eternal.